Hello and welcome to the Exponential View podcast. My name is Azeem Azhar and I'm the host and creator of the podcast and the newsletter of the same name. The podcast and that newsletter, Exponential View, are my ways of explaining how the world is changing under the force of technology. Today I'm in conversation with Professor Gina Neff. She's a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and at the Department of Sociology at the University of Oxford. And she studies the digital transformation of industries, personal tracking, and the sociology of technology and innovation. Now, before we get on to the conversation, I should note that we did have to do this podcast recording over a phone line, and there is some background noise, but the conversation itself is interesting enough for you to bear with it. For the next few weeks, the Exponential View podcast is sponsored by Spotify. I'm a massive fan of Spotify and I've used it as my music service of choice for several years. So it's exciting that Spotify has now rolled out a podcast service. This means you can find your favorite podcasts there too. Just launch it and search for Exponential View. So I start by asking Gina to give us a view on where we are in the current state of personal tracking devices.
One of the things that we really wanted to do with the book was create a set of conversations around what is influencing how people think about data about their lives, and then what's the cultural impact of that. One of the key differences for us was, the sets of communities that people want to understand and make sense of their data with haven't really changed. The idea that people have cultural awareness around certain kinds of activities and not others, that is a constant, right? That hasn't changed. But now we have connected devices and a widespread belief that if we can gather the data, we should. So gather first, ask questions later. And that's really what we wanted to challenge in the book.
That is such a wonderful framing, because that's exactly how we think, coming out of with a product mindset and coming out of a tech company or even a marketing department, is the data is bound to be useful at some point. So we ought to keep it as much of it as we can, and we can always go back to it. And funnily enough, in the IT world, then you have the reverse question, which is we're gathering all this data, but we're not doing anything with it.
For me, the moment of clarity really happened when someone who was in the midst of designing this product, the product was very close to market. There had been a lot of media buzz about this particular watch. He said, "We have no idea what we're doing with the data we're collecting. Can you help us figure out the questions to ask?" And for me, that's when it clicked that we have so created an economy based on the idea that the data has to be valuable, that people were going to market with devices without having thought through what would that ecosystem look like? What would that data ecosystem look like? And so our real charge for the self-tracking book was, why don't we talk to people who track themselves, find out what they're doing, what frustrates them, and really start to ask kind of questions. Okay, how could this look different? How could we imagine putting people more in charge of their data and having a kind of empathy for the activities and practices that they want to have and the things they want to learn from that process?
And what do people want to learn? When you spoke to people, what do they want to learn about themselves from their data, or what do they want to contribute by collecting that data in the first place?
There were so many wonderful experiments that we discovered in the Quantified Self community. And one of my favorite ones was this gold star chart. And this was done by a user experience designer who wanted to encourage herself to run. She'd never been a runner. And she said, what I like about tracking is the process of tracking makes me feel good, like I've earned a gold star. And so she takes this and runs with it and literally gives herself a gold star for every run, regardless of how long, regardless of the quality. She just gives herself that little reward. And then she looked back and saw that she had a record of positive outcomes, not a failure. And so I think figuring out what's motivating a self-tracking experiment and really being kind to yourself, right? Not trying to change everything at once, but understanding. So for you, Azeem, this idea that you like seeing the progress and you have a certain goal perhaps in mind, and you can track your way to that. That works for some people. For others, if they don't see really rapid progress, or they feel like they've had a setback, that can be devastating to their intentions. So, figuring out multiple ways that work, and then testing them is one of the practices we think really works in self-tracking.
And what you've discovered is that, in a sense, the culture of technology development is perhaps not to ask what those purposes might be and what those goals might be, but rather you start from the functional, which is we have the ability to take all the heart rates, or we have the ability to look at every click that you make, so we'll store it somewhere.
Well, absolutely. One of the devastating numbers that we have are the number of activity trackers, so standalone fitness devices that have gone unused within 6 months. Most of them, we know, fall into disuse only after fewer than 6 months.
Right.
So then what's happening in that process? And one of the arguments we make in the book is that companies haven't been very thoughtful about helping people ask the next question. So I think back to, my various, Fitbit. I had a Move, I had a Fitbit. I've tried out a lot of these different devices, and I would learn what a normal day of exercise looks like. And then my days kind of fall from that, right? So I didn't find them interesting or motivating over a long term, even though I had spent all of this time looking at self-tracking and self-tracking practices. Even I've left mine in the back of a drawer, battery dead.
Yeah, that's testament to something. So do you think it's that for a group of us, it's not that important in general? Maybe perhaps it's a majority of us, it's not that important or that motivating or beneficial to keep a regular eye? Or is it that we haven't yet got things that are tracking things, we haven't got devices that are tracking indicators that are important enough to us on an ongoing basis?
Or perhaps the question we should be asking is, are we developing the right questions for ourselves? And I think that that's a key difference for both social scientists and scientists alike, right? We think about gathering data and running experiments and having a finding allowing us to generate a whole host of new questions. Most self-tracking devices now that are being marketed and sold to consumers are based on an idea that data will be collected and then that will provide answers, not new questions. And that's what I think we really need to focus on, right? We need to think about how will putting detailed heart rate information on Apple Watches, how is that going to change the kinds of questions people ask? And those questions may not be scientifically valid. They may not have a basis in medical science, but they're going to open up who gets to ask questions. And that's where I think we're going to see a different shift in both self-tracking devices and the data ecology that form around them.
That's an interesting dimension, and it seems like there are a few different things that are going on. So on the one hand, you have products that are marketed that are in an alluring way that people buy and then never use. That seems to be like quite a minor harm. I mean, we live in this kind of consumer society where we're forever buying tchotchkes that are of no utility at all. And then you get this more nuanced piece, which is where someone literally has a device in their body and doesn't have access to the telemetry that it creates. I wonder about the extent to which we're putting we have the power to put quite powerful tools in the hands of individuals in ways that perhaps they aren't ready for. They haven't necessarily given consent for it. That in ways that might also challenge things they believe, even though the science is against them, and people are, in a sense, are entitled to those views. I mean, we've lived a very long time in our existing social dynamics and social systems without there being a kind of consistent telemetry about us and our lives, and we've now moved into a world where, whether we're buying Fitbits or not, we are consistently measured by the systems that exist in the world. In the world that we experience, right, from a subjective perspective. And I'll just give you a couple of more examples, maybe to make myself more clear. I mean, you drive in your car, and your car tells you the average speed that you have driven that car in, or your phone records without your necessarily knowing when you wake up and when you go to sleep, based on your last interactions with it. And so we're starting to construct a cloud of data about us, but in some senses we haven't explicitly gone off and said, this is what I want to happen.
I think there's two things in that. First, I truly believe people should have access and control over the data about themselves, and that they should be empowered to ask questions about that data, whether or not they're scientifically valid. So this sounds relatively radical when I talk to a group of clinicians, but we're already living in a data-rich world where people have phenomenal access to health information. Why not give them some tools to begin to encourage them to think about their lives in different ways? That the medical profession can't dictate that's already gone. They could lead in that conversation. They can see themselves as the coaches who help guide people in asking great questions about their health, but not that they're the only source of good information. Now, that said, Azeem, I think you've hit on another kind of topic. If there's all of this health-related data about us out there, then not only do I want to know what it is, but I want to know who else can make inferences from that data. The team at Microsoft Research discovered that they can predict an episode of disordered eating simply based on people's web search history. And they can see these changes in the patterns that indicate that an episode of disordered eating is about to happen. Now, this is both powerful because it gives a tool for people to think about how they can care for themselves and their loved ones if they're trying to manage a condition. On the other hand, it's not something we want to empower advertisers with. When people can make inferences about health indicators, we need to start treating that data with the sensitivity as if it's health data, whether or not it generates from web searches or from our smartphones.
Yeah, that is such a fascinating observation. This conversation is going to go in a couple of directions, but on this question of inferences, you're absolutely right. You can make such powerful inferences from what could be quite benign or trivial information. I mean, my previous company, which was acquired a few years ago, we were early on in building trust and reputation and authenticity metrics on Twitter. But it became quite clear that you could predict all sorts of personal and personality characteristics from that data as well. And also by using certain sort of behavioral attributes like homophily, which is birds of a feather flocking together, you could make predictions about people even if you didn't have any data about them, because you had the predictions about all the people around them. And so there is this challenge about what can you infer from across perhaps a number of different inference steps about somebody. And I think one of your researchers at the OII has published on this idea of what reasonable inferences should be allowed to be made from data, because it seems to be something that existing privacy rules don't worry about too much.
One of the phrases from legal scholarship that I've really found very useful in this is predictive privacy harms, from Kate Crawford and Jason Schultz, and they've thought about if we can narrow a person down to 80% likelihood we have exactly Azeem Azhar, right? Mm-hmm. Then is it a legal harm is it a privacy disclosure if we're pretty sure we have exactly this individual?
Right.
I think people are starting to realize, in the wake of the data scandals around elections, and now with increased news coverage of a smart home and IoT devices and geolocation data, that there is a kind of data double, as another author has called it, a data double that exists of them, and we can't see that double. We can't audit it. We can't see if it's actually saying accurate or fair things about us. We can't see how that data double is being used in decisions about our credit, about our in the United States, about our health insurance, about our employment, and that feels like it's out of our control.
And it seems like data doubles are with us to stay. It's almost impossible to imagine a world where we aren't going to interact in ways that are going to result in there being a data footprint. And on top of that, I think once you have that data, the ability for the technical systems, the algorithms, the maths, to then create some kind of phenotype or fingerprint or segmentation of you are so commonplace that sort of segmentation is going to happen very, very rapidly and very, very cheaply, soon to be done for free. And so I suppose the argument is data doubles can be extremely useful. They're also going to be inevitable, and turning them into microsegments is going to become free or very commonplace. So we need to have much more explicitly defined rights frameworks, privileges, and remedies available than are currently have been made available.
One of the authors who's really inspired me on this is an anthropologist, Bill Maher, who talks about data as having kinship rights. And so rather than think about just my data, right, it has two parents. Or in the case of data doubles, right, multiple parents. We have many, many parents, right? So we have the devices and the technology companies who have created, stored, circulate this information, but we also have my rights, and bringing in a notion of kinship rights suggests that you can't give up your data so easily, that because it comes from you, because you've created this thing, you have a set of rights and responsibilities that continue in perpetuity, that those rights are not easily voided. And that brings us to a very different kind of framework for thinking through how a future with data that empowers us, that gives us information, that helps us learn great things both about ourselves and accomplish fantastic things, is very different from a framework that says, okay, strap this cheap device on, please, and we're going to now know everything about you.
It brings to mind something that you retweeted from Frank Pasquale, which was he quoted an article that says, "Will schools crunch my prenatal health data back to my toddler into the appropriate preschool classroom? It seems only a matter of time before biological data is also enlisted into multi-generational systems of discipline."
I think we have to be really careful when we're raising these. I mean, we've so developed a belief that more data is always better, that we haven't even begun to think about what some of the long-term consequences are. We haven't thought about the environmental consequences of storage and maintenance. We haven't thought about the consequences of repair. And then because I think about organizations and industries, we really haven't thought about how we do long-term management of a data ecosystem. So, anybody who's worked with large scale data knows that something gets lost when you move data from one context to another, when you try to use data that's been collected in one realm and try to make inferences or use in another. And usually we understand those challenges, like what is lost. But too often, I think we're creating these notions that data are simply interchangeable. The thing that gives people pause is when they feel like they're not being fully brought into the kinds of conversations and they're not made fully aware of the kinds of data that are being collected and what's being done with that data. So the recent reporting around geolocation data and how fine-grained it is, and that it is gathering data about children, that we're gathering very sensitive data about where people live, where they work, where they visit, that begins to feel much more like surveillance than it does contributing to larger social good.
Just a reminder that support for Exponential View comes from Spotify. Now you can listen to your favorite music and podcasts in one spot with Spotify's new killer feature, the Podcast Hub. Now back to our conversation. And on that question of larger social good, in some countries when we look at organ donation, there's a regime of presumed consent, which is that if you sort of unfortunately die but still have good organs, the state can or the medical services can take those organs and put them on into the transplant list pool. Some people, I'm one of them, has argued that we should also think about having a presumed consent to share on certain classes of data that we generate about ourselves. Do you think that's a viable idea? Because that might be one way of getting access to the social good and demonstrating the benefits more broadly.
Potentially, but let me raise a risk that I see to that kind of data donation model from a sociological point of view. So, for example, I did 23andMe, direct-to-consumer genetics testing, along with one of my graduate research assistants. And, that data is not just mine, right? It's my genetic data is also data about my parents, and it's data about my children. And so here are, in a very sort of short way, here are people that I have implicated. And we're already starting to see some of the thorny legal questions. Can my genetic data implicate me in a crime? Can my genetic data be used to implicate a family member in a crime? And those are questions that we as a society haven't figured out yet. So while I think, we need to be cautious, we need to make sure that we're setting up these data donation regimes in ways that ensure that people won't be harmed from their own altruism.
This is making me think quite a great deal about the assumptions that we make about individuality, which I suppose from the Western tradition were most strongly reinforced by during the period of the Enlightenment and Mill and Wollstonecraft and so on. And actually, it was reasonably easy to cleanly define what an individual was, right? It was done by their physical parameters and their physical boundaries, and then some kind of test of their mental competence. And that test was usually about the age of the age of adulthood. And as we've moved into a world where our techniques network analysis, social graph analysis, the fact that we create these data trails, allow us to blur the boundaries between, what is Gina or what is Azeem, so we can be identified or implicated even if we are not physically there. And that seems to be quite a challenge. Two things have happened: my ability to exclude myself and define myself very clearly, which is my physical domain of my arms and my legs, my body and my head, has got much more blurred in the digital space, and so I reach much further out. These implications are 23andMe one you've discussed, but even simple things like my selfies. I don't take selfies, but if I did take selfies and they were on Instagram, might also put you at that particular restaurant because you're in the background. But the other thing that happens is that I don't need to be somewhere in order to be identified by the network in some way. And this seems to challenge, I suppose, the intellectual heritage that has set up the way in which we have thought about rights and responsibilities of the individual.
Right. I mean, this reminds me of a couple of things, right? That the extent to which our network has influence over us. And of course, the reason we know some of the incredibly interesting, fascinating findings are because we've had this expansion in data, right? So we can gather more data about more people, and we can do analyses that allow us to say things about the network. So for example, one of the best indicators that you will gain weight is that your Facebook friends are gaining weight. So your closest network contacts, it doesn't matter whether they're geo-located near you. It doesn't matter if you live near each other. It doesn't matter if you see them.
That is fascinating, and it raises it raises all sorts of questions about the systems that are being built by these technology companies. I have to say that in the last 3 or 4 years, when I've been looking extensively at the rate at which technologies have been developing, I have been quoting from Gramsci and Durkheim much more than I had done in the previous 20 years. So there is something about the sociological question that is coming to bear. What does history tell us about when we get to this sort of very sharp divergence? The divergence is that the technical technologies, the chips, the networks, the way they interact, the way they feed into each other, combined with the market technologies, are accelerating very, very quickly. The time it takes to train the ImageNet machine vision network has dropped from 60 minutes to 4 minutes in 15 months. Chip performance for ML chips is improving much faster than it ever has historically under the old Moore's law regime. Yet our sociological organizations, our group organizations, our collectives, our accountability systems don't seem to be evolving in response or just alongside those technological systems as quickly. So there is a significant divergence that seems to happen. Do you have some perspective of what happened in sort of previous times like this, or is this unprecedented?
I do have some perspective, but first I have to put on my sociology professor hat, and I have to ask you about Durkheim. So now I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay.
What have you used from Durkheim? Because there's a connection here, I think, of how we think about ourselves in society right now and this relationship to data.
I've mostly used Durkheim because I remember that he started to use empirical observation in terms of looking at how systems behaved. And if I remember, he actually went off and was an early anthropologist and was looking at sort of tribes in various extended parts of the world, and coming back to make claims that the way people constructed their understanding of the world was not purely empirical, that it was constructed also from inner beliefs as opposed to extensive measurements.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Durkheim, I think Durkheim's actually a really interesting model, and I don't want to get too geeky sociological theory for your listeners, but hear me out. So Durkheim is one of the first data-driven sociologists who says you can predict something as personal as the decision to commit suicide based on some sociological factors. And that these factors, he argued, kind of add up to what he called solidarity, that we understand our role and place in society, and we can have a sense of meaning and connection that isn't coming just from us, right? But it's coming about the set of relationships we're around. And so you're absolutely right. This kind of move that happened just before the beginning of the 20th century, where we started to see that we could use data to predict things about people. Durkheim has these beautiful charts, these early charts, looking at these different suicide rates in different cantons, Swiss cantons in different regions of France. But then, kind of taking it one step further and saying, what we're literally seeing is a transition from a more traditional society to modern industrial society. I mean, he mapped that. And so now what I've been calling for is that we start to think about a kind of networked solidarity, that we too are in this unprecedented moment of fine-grained data about ourselves. But the old kinds of ways of building connections and relationships across people are falling away. And we haven't quite yet, as a society, figured out what's going to replace that. But we know from Durkheim something has to. Otherwise, societies don't function very well. And so we're at this incredibly important pivot point of trying to figure out what's next.
Right. So that makes me think that you're arguing that we are at an perhaps not unprecedented, because we've been through these pivot points before, but we're at a very significant pivot point to try to understand what the rules of communities and groups and other structures need to be. Do you have any particular view of how that plays out? Is it through the existing mechanisms that we have for dialogue and discussion, or is it? Do you see signals that this is going to happen in some other fashion?
Well, one of the ideas that Durkheim had about 20th century, what he thought would happen in 20th century society, was that we would find meaning in the economy, that we really would find our way because of the division of labor, and we would come to understand that our jobs are important and we'd feel meaningful and satisfied and a part of something bigger than ourselves. And I'm not so hopeful that that's where we see the 21st century going. And particularly when we start to look at the changes that automation will likely have in the composition of the workforce, and when we see in US statistics, when we see this pretty rapid decline in men's labor force participation. So we see a pretty rapid decline in men participating in the labor force. People aren't getting that satisfaction from work. So there's going to have to be something else that helps society hold together.
Right. And one of the things that some people argue is that the thing that is helping tribes hold together is their fear, and then their anger, and then their hatred towards the other.
Right.
Which is not a very generative space to be in.
No. And certainly history teaches us that the kind of tribalism and nationalism is not, that's not a force that ultimately will serve all of society. That may serve the powerful. But it's not. It's certainly not the answer for the greatest number of people. It's it's the answer for domination, but it's not the answer for advancement.
No, I mean, I look at that tribalism that emerges, and I think the thing that I find, I don't want to necessarily say scary, but the thing that concerns me is that it's never been easier, thanks to both digital and physical and crossover technologies, to build walls rather than bridges. We can segment people in their information spheres and by their networks, and we can start to construct mechanisms of controlling them and keeping them apart, either through physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure. I mean, you can see within China, the application of social credit could be used to create virtual walls and virtual segments, but in terms of the access to real physical life resources. And so I think one thing that we might not have contended with in our thinking, and perhaps people who have, is given the rapidly declining cost of being able to segment, parcel, isolate, wall off, what do you need to do to avoid that being the fate of societies? Or are you able to find a way of making societies still focus on the well-being and the success and survival of their members in ways that are not necessarily zero-sum? And that dichotomy is a thing that I throw around in my head at the moment.
Mm-hmm. We have this kind of fundamental difference where we see across Europe and the United States, we see the rise of a far right and a kind of nationalism. And it's easy to say, well, that's happening at the same time that we have rapid fire dissemination of things through social media, through the internet. And yet the correlation that there's other forces that are happening there that aren't being discussed, right? So this idea that we have these filter bubbles and you just kind of fall into them and sink into them and you never see anything else, that's not a function of our information space. So then, so that's the walls. What about the bridges? How can we use the tools at our disposal to help people feel more empathy to one another? We know that social media allow us to feel very passionately when we read. We now, in the words of Zizi Papakuritsi, we now feel our way through the news when we have social media news, right? We don't think our way through. And so can we use, and I turn this back to you as a thinker, how can we begin to build this space that allows us to feel empathy and connection and not fear and dissatisfaction and oh me.
So I think we can do a couple of things as an optimist. One is we create a set of beliefs that there is a joint vision. And that joint vision is that we can think about human well-being in a sustainable way. And that we can really do that without having to go back to live like our ancestors did 2,000 years ago. We can do it in an advanced way that brings with it better health outcomes and all the other good things, and that can bring us together. And then we can start to be more purposive and intentional, display more intentionality around the products that we build. And one thing that I've noticed when I work with early stage companies and founders and entrepreneurs, and I spend some time with a VC firm, is that very few founders are coming with a new advertising technology or a new game. People are coming up with products and services that are not necessarily climate change related, but they do much more closely connect to human well-being or health outcomes, or increasing the value of how we as humans with agency spend our time, rather than finding out ways of getting us to spend our money. And I think I feel quite a little bit more optimistic about that. But then on the other hand, I don't think our systems of accountability are working very well, and we have about 12 years or 2 business cycles to really make headway on carbon output. Well, Gina, thanks for making the time on this this conversation. I mean, it's really been very inspiring and educational for me.
And for me, I really appreciate the chance to get to chat with you and appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks for listening to the Exponential View podcast. We will be back next week with another cracking conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you then.